So to start off, could you tell us a little bit about your background and where you come from?
Yeah, for sure. Um, my name is Jerome Matawaran. I was born and raised here in the East Bay, uh, Rodeo, California. Grew up to I guess you could call it middle class family. But my parents came over here from the Philippines. My dad came here in 19 I think 74 75. Brought my mom over in 1984, and they've been here ever since. I grew up in the East Bay, and I attended when I turned 18. I moved out to SF, and I attended San Francisco State University. And after I graduated, um, I attended university, or I'm currently attending University of San Francisco in the Urban Ed and Social Justice program. I guess that's a little bit of background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you,
Great.
so you say that you were raised in the East Bay and then you came to SF State. Was SF State where you got kind of your first start or like exposure to ethnic studies? Could you elaborate more on like where that started for you?
Yeah, very much so. I actually didn't. I didn't have much exposure to any type of like social justice, critical thinking, or ethnic studies mindset or lens or framework of thinking until college, right? And I think
Oh,
in elementary and middle school, I think like at times I thought I was Mexican or I thought I was black or things like that. And of course, like I went to a lot of Filipino gatherings and whatnot, but I didn't know truly what it meant to be ethnically, like what is ethnicity, things like that, and what it meant to be Filipino in this society, in the world that I guess I'm experiencing, right? And it wasn't until right I went to SF State and I took I think the first class I took was I think at the time was AFRS 215 Black Family Studies with Professor Kevin Washington, and that was one of the first classes that I took that I really got a deeper understanding of the history of systemic structural inequity and racism that still persists today. And that kind of was my step into the door of, um, I guess, understanding that there's a lot wrong with the world. But yeah,
I see. So it was like your call to action somewhat, like learning those things with your professor the first year.
in a way, yeah, I was surrounded by a lot of professors who were very welcoming and who pushed me to think in ways that I haven't, I guess, thought of before. Um, so yeah, yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah.
That's an awesome story.
Yeah. I'm currently at SF State, so I kind of really relate to that experience with the being professors. I feel the same way about them being so welcoming and really trying to push you to think.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe you would go to the
Yeah.
next one.
Sure. So, okay, so since you're involved with ethnic studies here in San Francisco, could you tell us about like the programs you do, what you're teaching, and what drives that passion to continue doing it? I mean, it can't be easy doing it in this remote situation, and I can't imagine it's easy even in an in-person setting. So please, you
Um,
share.
yeah, yeah, definitely. It is, I guess, um, this is my third year here at in SFUSD teaching ethnic study. I teach ethnic studies and U.S. history, and
Okay, that's awesome.
yeah, it's definitely been a learning experience for me um, to kind of to think of ideas of what it was going to be like going into the classroom and have an idea of what type of impact I'm going to have. But the ethnic studies, I guess, the ethnic studies program here, right, is really, really, really dope and supportive. So the folks that brought me in, right, Art Nelson Concordia. I don't know if y'all know Art Nelson. He's the dude, right? Art Nelson Concordia and Nikhil Loud.
Hmm.
Um, these two are the I think they're the co-directors of the ethnic studies program here, and they
Hmm.
really supported me and helped me, I guess, build the program over at Galileo, where I'm teaching now. So I'm at
Hmm.
Galileo High School. Right? I teach ethnic studies to all grades, right, 9 through 12,
Wow.
mixing the classes, right? But I think the main, I guess the main purpose that I want or that we strive to grow towards are certain principles in the ethnic studies program what we want students and me as well, like we want the community to grow towards, is these principles of love and respect, right? Hope, solidarity, unity, community, and critical consciousness. And
Mhm.
yeah, those are some of the things that we try to work towards, right? And depending on, right, I guess uh, what type of feedback we're getting from previous years, we continually change and adapt the curriculum to better meet the needs of the students that are attending or that are showing up and that are there. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, I'm also the sponsor of BSU over at Galileo,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's dope. I'm blessed, right? I'm not black, right? I'm Filipino American, right? I'm full Filipino as far as I know. But to be able to be in a space to engage with young black scholars is definitely a blessing. So I'm definitely in a lot of I have a great opportunity to be able to engage with young people and the places that I'm put in. But yeah.
Mhm. Do you think that teaching, history and ethnic studies, do you feel like at the same time, do you incorporate the ethnic studies, like some principles that you would teach in ethnic studies in your history classes, or like vice versa? Because I think that what we've learned through these interviews that we've been doing is that's kind of the greatest connect, right? Like in history class, you're not learning really about anything other than a white history, right?
Yeah.
So I'd like to know more. Yeah.
No, yeah. I definitely I approach almost any space I'm in, especially academic spaces I'm in, with the lens or framework of like ethnic studies and critical race theory, things like that. And
Okay.
with ethnic studies and U.S. history, what I tend to I guess a lot of people have sort of a misinformed ideas of what ethnic studies classes are, like
Mhm.
Arizona, Tucson, Arizona, whatnot. People think we indoctrinate students, right? But how I approach both classes is to provide students with as much a 360 view of an event as possible, to for them to kind of develop the tools and skills necessary to read that, right? And to read in between the lines, and to not only read the word but read the world as it is kind of developing through past, present, and connecting to the future, right? So I try my best. Um, I try my best to I guess not, you know, tell students that this is the history, that this is the truth, that this is the one thing, but that
Mhm.
history is kind of interwoven with many truths, mistruths, misinformations, lies, and all that. And what we have to do, and what we have to train ourselves to do, is to be able to identify, right, to identify systems, right, systems and ideologies and institutions that try to misconstrue the way that people see and understand history for their benefit, right?
Mhm.
And so when history is told in a certain way, right, often told by the winning side, right, what we call master narratives, right? And what I try to present is as many counter narratives as possible for students to identify what they think. What do you think that this history means for you? What does it mean for us as a people moving forward?
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's a really great way to explain it. Yeah. No, it really is. It really
Thank you.
is.
Thank you.
I definitely completely got your
I
entire
was
point.
okay, good. I get worried because it's like it's confusing.
Yeah.
You know, even when I'm saying it, I'm like, I hope this makes sense. You know, it's not confusing, because
No, it definitely
sometimes it
made
doesn't even make
sense.
sense to me. But yeah, thank you. Right on.
Yeah. So do you see implementing ethnic studies as an appropriate and necessary response to like the issues that we see in the Bay Area and just kind of, I guess, the country, or just like in the city, that we see what's going on in relation to race and just kind of the things that ethnic studies cover?
Man, oh wow, that's the deep question there. And there's a lot of ways to answer this, but in short, yes, I think it is. Um, I think it is relevant. I think it is appropriate. And in some cases, I think it is necessary, right? Or I would say in most cases, right? People could make
Mhm.
arguments otherwise, but I think in most cases that it is a necessary step forward in changing the way that we view education and systems in education, right? There's a lot of, I mean, I'm not saying that like teachers today or programs today aren't, you know, addressing needs of student, things like that. But I think overall, right, that the education system needs reform, and a lot of that starts in how we build our classrooms and how we push for different measures to adopt and to adapt ethnic studies into our curriculum, right? And for our class, for my class, right, what I see is that it gives my students an opportunity to kind of develop the language necessary to be able to identify and name what's happening in their world, right? Because when I was younger, of course, I experienced racism, I experienced sexism, I experienced patriarchy, right? I experienced homophobia, right? And I was in large part, you know, perpetuating a lot of those things, right?
Mhm.
Which kind of, you know, developed a lot of, I guess, maladaptive survival techniques to get through school, right?
Mhm.
And for me, how I see ethnic studies, it gives my students and students who engage in those practices, right, to be able to, I guess, unpack some of these things and the language to kind of to be able to have a conversation and to break it down, to rebuild, right, and to not just see, I guess, the wrong in things, or see things that, you know, see themselves or us as, you know, people as victims, but rather as survivors who are continuing to shape the future, right? And that's what I hope for, at least in my, or in my engagements in class.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome that that remains the scope of the way that you approach teaching, because then you have like this greater push towards something. Because I think, at least in my experience, when ethnic studies was taught to me, there were times where I kind of felt like where does this go beyond this point, right? Beyond this classroom, how do I continue doing whatever it is I'm learning here, right? So I think it's really awesome that you have that scope around your approach to teaching. This kind of carries into the next question, which is, you know, you teach ethnic studies at Galileo grade 9 through 12, right?
Yeah.
Is that mandated by Galileo, or is it something that the students pushed for, or like how did that come to be?
Yeah, so ethnic studies actually in SFUSD was actually they've been fighting for it for
Right.
multiple years to have ethnic studies. At first, they pushed to have it as a what is it called, an elective in schools, right? So they pushed to have it as an elective. And recently, right, they ethnic studies scored a major victory in having a plan to implement and have it as a requirement,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think the goal, I could be wrong, right? But I think the goal is to have it implemented and funded in high schools throughout SFUSD by like 2022 or something like that, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't something that it's not something that's been there. This is something that the community fought for, and a lot of it is youth led, right? So a lot of community members, a lot of community leaders, right, took the, you know, they took the message from the young people who are saying, yeah, we need to have this in schools. Like, so we have students who come through the ethnic studies program, and they kind of you know, develop that agency to say, like, we need this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Young people need this in other spaces. Having the privilege to be able to experience and to be exposed to this type of education in a revolutionary way, it really is a privilege. And what we should be doing with our privileges is being able to expand those for other people. And I think that's what young people in SFUSD really showcased and modeled for us older folks, right? Yeah.
Mm, I see. Could you talk about one of the units that you teach in your class and talk about, you know, the different aspects of what you bring to the table, what you find that students bring back to you? Like, basically, teach us your unit.
For sure. I guess I could break it down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, the unit that we always start with in ethnic studies or that I always start with, I don't know about other classes, right? But the unit that I always start with is identity and narrative,
Yeah.
right? And so this year it looked a little bit different because of the whole distance learning and whatnot. But typically, right, we begin ethnic studies kind of, um, I guess, identifying or self-identifying, right? And getting like building community with one another, getting to know each other, because to be honest, a lot of the topics that we're going to cover over the year, right? Systemic oppression, racism, and things like that are not easy to talk about, and people are going to disagree, right? And so what I feel we need to begin with is to build some sort of foundation to understand who is in the classroom, and to be able to look
Mm,
around and build community and say, I can trust these people if I say something that, we can have a conversation and dialogue about it, rather than be afraid of speaking. And that when we do share, we lift each other up, things like that. So with identity and narrative, it really begins with breaking down what is identity, right? What are the different lenses through which we view identity, right? What are markers of identity, right? So we talk about race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, citizenship, and so on and so forth, right? There's an infinite ways through which we could view how we identify. And there's an infinite amount of ways we can identify and self-identify and transform and change as people, right? And
mhm,
so that's the beginning point, is breaking down and and really talking out what it means, what our identity means to us, right?
mhm,
And through that, right, understanding who is in the classroom, but also interrogating yourself and your own experiences, right? How have I kind of experienced the world, and why, right? If I identify as a Filipino American hetero privileged male, how has that affected the way that the world has received me, and how I have received what the world is bringing, right? What ways have I
mm,
experienced privilege? What ways have I experienced oppression, right? And not in ways that were like creating a hierarchy for, you're more privileged than me, you're more oppressed than me, but understanding that we're all kind of in this nexus, or this in this fight or struggle together, right? And
mm.
so that's where we begin with identity and narrative. And I guess the culminating project, it kind of transforms every now and then, but what we tend to do in class is an autoethnography, right?
Mm.
And it could take different forms or different shapes, right? If you're doing a presentation, we could do a road of life presentation. Sometimes I have students do a soundtrack of life presentation, or I have them create what we call a talong buhay, which they're telling, stories of their life, right? Connected to the past, present, future. But in essence, right, is that we do an autoethnography for them to kind of interrogate their lived experiences. And that's where the stepping point is for us to begin larger discussions on, um, social justice, race, and class, and all that stuff. Right?
That
Yeah.
That
sounds
sounds
like an amazing class. I can't
I
I
would
can't
hope.
envision
I
that
hope
in my
so.
high school career at all.
I
uh,
hope so.
it seems like you're really
Right.
like on top of building community, it's building mindfulness and
Hmm.
yeah, really just getting laying those foundational bricks. So when you are, talking about those tough issues, it's you're able to have a conversation and not really be, like she said, he said, back and forth. So
Yeah.
really, really helpful. Um,
Right on.
so our next question is, what do you think are the biggest impediments to implementing ethics studies education? Just like in mind of AB 331 and having it being in a
Um, Man, there's a lot, I guess, but the biggest, I guess that's just my own subjective opinion, but from what I understand is that I think I mentioned earlier, but a lot of folks have um, a kind of misconstrued idea or perception of what ethnic studies classes are. Some people say that they're just easy classes where people just talk about their feelings and stuff like that. And I'm like, first of all, it's not easy to talk about your feelings, okay? So anyways, but so people tend to say things like that, and also, right, people tend to think that it is like indoctrination or things like that, right? And so one is, I think that there is a lack of open-mindedness or understanding or empathy when it comes to implementing things that people aren't used to. I think there's a lot of pushback because of that. And also when it comes to funding, right, where is the money coming from, right? So we might even have well-intentioned people who want ethnic studies, but then they don't see it as practical because schools are already being squeezed of all the money that's being put into them, right? And so how do we address the funding for this, right? Because we're going to have to train and hire, right? We're going to have to train and hire teachers. So that's one of the issues that I see being a kind of an obstacle or a roadblock. But I also think another one too is this idea that um, copy and pasting an ethnic studies program into another, right, from one district to another, is seen as this cookie cutter idea that way, right, what works in SFUSD is going to work in Oakland, or even like what works in Galileo is going to work at Balboa, things like that, right? Or saying that that ethnic studies alone is the answer, right? That's what I worry, because if people are untrained and they haven't been through ethnic studies classes, or they're not trained in ethnic studies praxis and pedagogy, right? Then ethnic studies is just another class that will contribute to the not the achievement gap, but the educational debt that we're piling up to our most targeted communities, most targeted marginalized communities,
Wow.
right?
You're like the first one to bring up funding.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
are
Really,
the first interviewer to bring up funding, and to
that's
also bring
interesting.
up the delineation between, high school to high school, city to city. Do you, this might be like, I just kind of want to pick your brain
Go
now
for
because
it. Go
you
for it.
brought
It's
it
all
up,
good.
but how do you suppose, like, let's just talk about San Francisco since we're all familiar. Michaela and I both went to Lincoln, and you teach at Galileo. So, how do you suppose, like, that could be addressed within the parameters of SFUSD? Just hypothetically speaking.
Hmm. I think it
Hypothetically.
is. Yeah, I think it is. It's a multi-pronged approach, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because we could change public policy, but public policy doesn't necessarily change the way that people think or feel about things, right? We could
Mm-hmm.
change the way that people think or feel about things, but if these people aren't put in positions of power where they feel that their vote matters or things like that, right, then we're not going to have the right people in power that are going to push for the proper legislation that supports the funding for money to be in the right places, right? So I think schools have to be in engagement and talk with community members, as well as, right, leaders in the community who are like-minded, and we need to push to have people in places that are down for the people, right? We need to go out and vote. We need to go out into our communities and talk to the community. What is it that our communities need, right? We need to be in conversation with people, right? And we have to have the proper conversations and dialogue, right? And so it is a lot of things, right? But for me, I think my role in that as an educator is one, to create a space where students could find out the answer for themselves, right? What do they think their role is in that? But also equipping, not equipping, but giving students a space where they could create and craft and access their agency to say that I can be a force of positive change in this community. And through that, right, through that, like, change in yourself and the change in the small circles that you operate and share space with, right, it's a trickle effect, right, in other spaces, right? You change the way you speak and operate and share space with one another in a more humanizing way. That's more understanding of the reason why we need funding to be in not just schools, right, but community programs, right, in Black-led organizations, right? Why we need funding to go to, right, the most targeted people in this society. Why we need to give land back to indigenous people, things like that, right? But I think that's a large part of it for me, is to be able to support students in that growth to be agents of change, right? As well as to serve as a model, and to do what I can as a leader in my communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. Wow. Um, all right. That's a lot to process.
Same. Yeah. Same.
But it's great. It's so, I think you are actually our last interview of this entire interview series.
Word.
And so Michaela and I have sat through a lot of these interviews and talked about, this the template doesn't really change, but the conversation goes in so many different directions.
Yeah.
So I think your perspective and experience is really empowering to the discussion because you bring so many different ideas that
Yeah.
we just haven't heard of to this point. We've interviewed 7 people, so
Right on.
including Nikhil. He was the first one. So
Yo,
yeah.
my homie. That's my mentor right there. Shout out to Nikhil. But also to add on, right? You're talking about funding and how I think part of that is to deconstruct the prison industrial complex, right? I think that's something that I didn't mention that should be mentioned, is that they talk about the school to prison pipeline of,
Yeah.
the capitalization of prison and whatnot, and the school to prison nexus, right? That we are actively, every single citizen in this country is actively participating and complicit in that act, right? And I think I just read a statistic today that no single state in the United States spends more money on its students than it does on its prisoners, right? They spend more money per capita on prisoners than our young scholars, which
Mhm.
is a problem, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know if it's true. This is like off. Well, it's like same topic as
It's
school
all
prison
good.
pipeline, but like,
Yeah.
is it? I don't know if you like can confirm it, but they used our like third grade reading scores to translate to building more prisons.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I forget who the scholar was that they called it this idea of tracking. They use elementary school scores to target and predict the amount of spaces that they're going to need in prisons to house these underperforming students and delinquents,
Mhm.
right?
So it starts really early. That's
Yeah.
something that I did not know about.
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I know. That was like something I heard, but I wasn't too sure that was like actually the fact that Freedom was doing that, the type of tracking, because my reading scores in elementary school was not it. And it's like,
It's all
that
good.
they predicted like I would be there, but we're not.
Right? It's funny because they have a prediction of where you're going to be. So when people like us make it out, they say, we're the exception, right? So it's interesting. So they say that we're the exception, that we weren't supposed to access higher education. We're not supposed to access employment and upward mobility. But I think that is centered on this deficit idea that that we're not supposed to do well. But what I think is my folks that didn't make it out, right? My folks that are locked up now, my folks that weren't able to weren't able the opportunity or choice to access higher education. I think they're the exception, right? We all have a right to be able to
Mm.
decide for ourselves if we want to take this route or not. It shouldn't be decided for us in third grade, right? We're
Mhm.
not the exception, right? They are, right?
Yeah, definitely. So our last question is, how do you suggest to students watching this video when it goes up in a couple of weeks, how do you think that they should practice, ethnic studies values in their daily lives and carry, what is being taught in the classroom out into the world and practice?
Jeez. I think a lot of it has to do with is um, how we access ourselves and how we hold ourselves accountable to our growth, um, academically, mentally, emotionally, um, intellectually, whatnot. But I really think that we need to be grounded in ideas of humanization, right? And to access, right, our ability to be transformational leaders in our communities and within ourselves, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's a big part of it, is being able to build up the ways in which we humanize one another, right? How are we, the question that I ask myself very often, like when I begin the day, when I begin a class, is when I'm like coming up with lesson plans, is how am I going to disrupt hopelessness? How am I going to disrupt, right, school to prison pipeline? How am I going to disrupt, right, racism, sexism, right, classism, ageism, right? How are things that I'm doing and how are ways in my being, right, actively transformative in their resistance, right? Because we could engage in different forms of resistance. I think it's Daniel Solorzano and Dolores Delgado Bernal, who talk about transformative resistance and different ways that we can engage in resistance that could be self-defeating, conforming, and whatnot, and also transformative, right? So I think of how my actions are affecting myself and those around me. But I think there's a lot of ways that we could engage in ways to build up our communities. This is just my own understanding of it. But yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. You've
I
brought a lot to the
appreciate y'all.
table. You brought a lot to the table. I'm not gonna lie. You brought a lot to the table.
Thanks, y'all. I appreciate y'all a lot.
Thank you.
Kayla, right on. I appreciate y'all very
Yeah.
much. All right.
Yeah.
Thank y'all.
Thank you so much.
Right on. Y'all take care.
Take care.